Yehuda Amichai was a 20th century Israeli poet and was one of the very first to write in what we now know to be colloquial modern-day Hebrew. He was born in Germany and moved to British Mandate Palestine when he was 12, quickly moving with his family to Jerusalem more than a decade before the establishment of the State of Israel. In his poem, When I Was Young, the Whole Country Was Young, he writes of Israel that when I first fell in love, they proclaimed her independence, and when my hair fluttered in the breeze, so did her flags. When I fought in the war, she fought. When I got up, she got up too. And when I sank, she began to sink with me. Throughout Amichai's lifetime and beyond, the State of Israel was born, and cities like Jerusalem were built into the vibrant, modern cultural places that you would experience today. American-Israeli author Sarah Tuttle Singer describes the streets of Jerusalem as full of smells like coffee, ripe strawberries, and saffron, and full of religious diversity, where you can go and buy Christmas lights during Ramadan right next to a yeshiva. Jerusalem is a city that we know with world-renowned university, with state-of-the-art hospitals, and globally recognized museums. A city where all of the sidewalks and buildings are made from Jerusalem stone, which is a slippery golden limestone that unifies the ancient and the brand new buildings under one seamless, shimmering skyline. But tomorrow night, those same streets will look a little different as the Jewish community observes Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, except for when the 9th day falls on Shabbat. It's a day of mourning that remembers the destruction of the holy temples in Jerusalem, as well as a number of other days of Jewish expulsion and suffering throughout history. In an article published earlier this week, Rabbi Bradley Artson describes observing Tisha B'Av specifically in Jerusalem as a paradox, in which a bustling modern city sits and mourns its ancient destruction. In many ways, Tisha B'Av marks the end of ancient Jewish sovereignty and a period of security where a nation lived in its own land and determined its own future. Tisha B'Av marked the beginning of a 2,000-year dream to be, as Hatikvah, a 19th century poem that eventually became Israel's national anthem, states, to be a free people in a free land. That was the dream. Now, the city of Jerusalem is the capital of a Jewish state, a daily realization for the people of Israel, in addition to the land and the state of Israel. On Tisha B'Av, we mourn the journey of anti-Semitism, of persecution, and of pain that it took to reach this very moment. And as part of the ritual observance, it is traditional to read the words of Lamentations, of Eicha. The scroll laments the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem and the exile of the tribe of Judah. The Talmud attributes the writing of Eicha to the prophet Jeremiah, and the book describes the suffering in Jerusalem during this time while grappling with the theological explanations for suffering. The first lines of Lamentation begin with Jerusalem sitting empty after having once been a great city that used to be filled with people. Now they are gone and they have gone into exile. The text says that God has afflicted this pain upon the city for her transgressions, which is understood to be sinat chinam, the senseless hatred that we had for one another. The city has been overtaken bein hametzarim, between the narrow places. Rashi understands this narrowness as a physical depiction of the geography in Jerusalem, making it hard to escape from narrow streets with tall tall sides. It's a haunting image, really, and a stark contrast to those descriptions that Yehuda Amichai gives, that Sarah Tuttle Singer gives, and that I'm sure if you have traveled to Israel recently, that you would give of the city as well. And if we turn to the Psalms, we find a similar use of the word metzar, of this deep, narrow strait. But this time, instead of a city in its depths, it is us. From the depths of distress, I call out to you, Adonai, who heard me and who answered my cries. So here, what's the difference between the theologically challenging text of Eicha and the more uplifting psalm? From here, we find wisdom where we have been looking for it all summer long, in Pirkei Avot. In chapter 5, we learn that every machloket l'shem shamayim, every dispute that is for the sake of heaven, will endure. Why? Because the goal of these disagreements were to find truth, and they all begin with an understanding that the parties involved both have good intentions and good values. Teachers Hillel and Shammai had many, many disagreements throughout their time, and even though most of the time Hillel won, both arguments have been preserved over time. The two never hated each other. And there is even a Talmudic story about how their daughters were allowed to marry one another. But this is not always the case. And part of our purpose as we remember the destruction is to remember the values that we stand for. Yesterday, in the Times of Israel, there was an article trying to understand how somebody who had previously been convicted of indictment to racial hatred could be leading a political party that is currently polling to receive over 10% of Israel's congressional seats. This is more than a machloket l'shem shamayim. This is sinat chinam. This is senseless hatred. And while most of us in this room cannot vote in the next Israeli election, which is coming up, it is beholden upon us to speak up and acknowledge that when we see or hear something about Israel or otherwise that speak to our values and who we are, that go beyond being a disagreement for the sake of heaven, to speak up and to say something. It is what keeps us out of this narrow darkness, and it remains where we as a community have worked so hard to reach in these last 2,000 years. At one time or another, we all feel stuck in the depths of narrow straits. So let these two juxtaposed images of Jerusalem, one of ancient destroyed rubble and one of a beautiful, modern, thriving city, serve as reminders for each of us. We have the power of leaving the rubble and the senseless hatred in our communal past, and to be part of what continues the vibrancy that we see in the modern city of Israel and that we can feel when we come together as part of the larger people of Israel. May it be God's will. Ken Yehi Ratzon.